Hello and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. My name is Sarah Small and I'm Food Tank's Chief of Staff. I'm really excited about today's webinar with Jeanette Gurung. She is the founder and executive director of the Women Organizing for Change in Agriculture and Natural Resource Management, or WOCAN, W-O-C-A-N. WOCAN is a global network with over 1,100 members in 109 countries that support capacity building for women's leadership and empowerment, as well as gender mainstreaming. Jeanette is a forester and gender and development expert whose career has focused on leading organizational change for gender equality within agriculture and natural resource management organizations in Asia and Africa. In this webinar, Jeanette will discuss her views on what is needed to bring about significant changes on a global scale through investments in women farmers and their collectives. So this webinar will be recorded today and posted later on foodtank.com. You can also follow along and participate on Twitter using #FoodTank. And please submit your questions using the chat box on your webinar jam, or you can email them to me, Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, @foodtank.com. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A session with Jeanette. So without further ado, Jeanette, it is truly an honor to have you here today. We're really thrilled to have you speaking on behalf of Food Tank, and we're excited to hear your presentation. So I will give you the floor now.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And good morning, good afternoon and good evening to everyone who may be listening to the webinar. I'm very thrilled to have this opportunity to share some ideas and plans and things that get me excited that I've been thinking about for the last couple decades. I would first like to describe what I see as the situation today, which is, and we've been working in this sector for quite some time, I have to say about 3 decades, and we know very much now about the role that women play as not only just the secondary farmers, but actually in many cases the primary farmers, as well as the natural resource managers within rural communities across the developing world. And this is noting that they're not only involved in the production of crops, but that actually it goes far beyond that to do all of that's required to put food on the table and get it to the market. And that requires securing water and energy for both their subsistence as well and livelihood needs, as well as those of market production. And they do this under pretty incredible constraints with insecure rights to land and inadequate knowledge and capital. And what I want to talk about today, and none of this is news to probably most of you on the call, this has been very well researched. I think we know a lot. There was an FAO study that came out a few years ago that's widely quoted that said if women had the same access to productive resources that men do, they could increase the yields on their farms by 20 to 30% and raise total agriculture input by from 2.5% to 4%, reducing the number of hungry people in the world by 12 to 17%. So I think it's not any longer a question of not having the statistics, not knowing the research. There have also been years and years of hard work by activists and advocacy efforts to promote these needs throughout at all levels, from the UN all the way down to community levels. But still, by and large, despite some progress in the field, we're still looking at the situation where women are not recognized as farmers, often very often excluded from decisions that go on in the multiple levels around both food security and climate change. And so we're sort of missing this very key element is as we tackle these very difficult problems. It sometimes even astounds me. I have to say last year I was in a meeting in Asia of agriculture sector, corporates, corporations, NGOs, and others. And I listened for 2 days to experts talk about farmers and always referring to them in the masculine form, with no particular recognition of the fact that the kind of issues that women farmers face are different than those of men. And so even in 2015, still was a surprise that I have to stand up and make a statement to the group that, you know, the face of the farmer, we need to change our way of thinking about this and stop talking about farmers and their wives, and perhaps even change the narrative to talk about farmers and their husbands, so that we can start to put the right picture on the face of the farming and agriculture sector. So I think because of women's very high reliance on natural resources, in these conditions often of deep poverty, with their limited access to land and property, it's really critical, their dependence on local natural resources for livelihoods, and the effects of climate change, including drought, uncertain rainfall, deforestation, and other things, are making it harder and harder for women to secure these resources. And so it's more important than ever. And when there is other exclusion that goes on by development agencies, by donors, by NGOs and others who are actually excluding, and I don't use that word exclusion lightly. Nobody wants to see themselves as excluding others, but I think it's really time that we have to see this for what it is. Even some international level organizations that are attempting to make sure that farmers are well paid and being compensated for their work are also not recognizing that that compensation is not reaching women farmers because of some of the gender constraints and structural constraints that exist within countries that actually do exclude women from participating in decision-making at certain levels of farmer cooperatives, producer associations, etc. There's also, of course, this is confounded by the fact that women are not compensated in the labor that they're putting into food production is usually not compensated in any way because so much of it is for subsistence needs. And this is, again, something that many feminist economists are struggling with, is how do we find a way to compensate women for the kind of labor and knowledge that they put into caring for the families and communities on a daily basis. But I would also like to say that this exclusion extends also into the world of professionals. WOCAN itself is a global network of women professionals, also men, who are professionals in the agriculture sector and natural resource management sectors. And we really created WOCAN about 12 years ago because of our own exclusion as women from decision-making related to women's empowerment and gender equality within our very organizations, be they that of the United Nations or governments or NGOs working to secure agricultural production and forest management around the world. So these are the gender biases. As a forester, I can tell you that the gender bias within the forestry sector is extremely strong in many countries of the world. And it's just women are not recognized as foresters in any way. So I don't want to talk so much about that. I want to talk about here what we can do and how we can really scale up and make a difference so that we're not 10 years from now still bemoaning the same situation that exists to this day. There's many things that can be done. I think we need to listen a lot more to women farmers. Some years ago, when the Gates Foundation started targeting women farmers in its agricultural development programs, they told me one thing that stuck in my mind, which is that every day when they go to work, the staff of the Gates Foundation, they turn on their computer and the picture of a woman farmer comes up on the screen with a statement at the bottom that says, "What have you done for her today?" I thought that was a wonderful way to sort of put women farmers right at the center and listen to their reality. I think it's not rocket science to find ways to support programs and initiatives that meet their needs. Look for creative answers and talking to women farmers. I'm always surprised within my own community of forestry people that once they get it and they understand how important it is, they're blocked by this sense that they don't know how to go ahead. My point is just do it. Go ahead and do something. It's really, you can't make mistakes necessarily. It's not rocket science. The mistake is not to do anything at all. The other thing that we've really become convinced of at WOCAN is the need to support women's groups and women's organizations at the community level. It's quite astounding, and I will show you a slide here. It talks about the gap for funding for women's groups. You can see that there's less than this is the MDG's spending, less than 1% was specifically targeted addressing women's rights. But I want to say that even of this 1%, women's organizations were receiving just 9% of these funds. So all the rest of the funds are used by international NGOs and development agencies who may have a women's empowerment, gender equality program. But nonetheless, it does seem natural that some of this money needs to come to women who themselves can determine what to do with it. So we need to find both social and economic empowerment and support it in ways that are game-changing. And we need to facilitate changes in both the conditions, which are the economic aspects of empowerment, as well as the positions of women. And this refers to the socio-political status of women, so that they themselves are able to direct more of the resources. And clearly we need to get more and more men engaged in this at all levels. We do a training course on we call it reframing leadership for gender equality. And we find men to be fantastic participants in those women's leadership courses and come forth with all sorts of support and ideas on how they can personally, as well as professionally, support women's leadership. And I think we just need to do a lot more of this. However, as I said, a lot of these recommendations have been repeatedly identified, included in various calls for actions, proclamations at the highest level, etc. We do have some donors. I will say there's still a handful of government donors that will invest in gender and agriculture. We still have a very wide gap between people who want to invest in gender equality and women's empowerment, who are often focusing more on the so-called softer issues of education, reproductive health, domestic violence. And then there's a sense that that doesn't have much to do with agriculture and natural resource management. So we're still continually trying to bridge this conceptual divide, even within the development assistance players of the world. But what I think we can do is to both up the game and to bring more carrots and sticks to the situation, that can enable the creation of drivers that will take us to scale. And I would say these drivers are of three kinds: incentives, compliance, and investments. And the incentives are what make it worthwhile for companies, governments, development agencies, NGOs to change behaviors, reallocate resources, and support activities that invest in women very consciously. And we're all trying to create those kind of incentives and think very creatively and innovatively about this. But I think one of the untapped things to date is the idea of a consumer interest. And we all know that nowadays consumers are more and more demanding and more interested in knowing the sources of their whatever they are buying. And again, if we could imagine kind of a fair trade for women type of situation where consumers use their pocketbook and their consumer decision making to choose products that are in fact doing something to help women up and down the supply chain is one type of incentive. And I'll talk a little bit later about another type of incentive that WOCAN's been working on. The second one would be compliance. And of course, I don't think we have a compliance mechanism that brings much of a a type of a stick to organizations. And there would be those who disagree with me and would say that donor conditions to funding makes sure that there's a kind of a compliance with that. In our experience, it's not compliance. It's because it's not held, people are not held accountable to whatever they claim to be doing for women's empowerment and gender equality. And I say this even in relation to WOCON itself. If we are not ever asked to provide the evidence of the results for what we're doing, but we're simply reporting in the outputs and inputs of what we're doing, how many people we're training, how many women we're training, that's the extent of the activity in many cases. So I think the point being here that gender mainstreaming, for all of its importance, has not yet developed a kind of an accountability mechanism around it that's been meaningful, so that it's not been able to deliver the kind of change that we would all seek to find. Now, there's a lot of talk in these days about the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, that for the first time have a standalone goal number 5, for women's empowerment and gender equality. This seems to be driving, in my mind, a number of private corporations and private sector institutions that seem to want to be meeting these SDGs, addressing SDGs, and creating even internal targets for women's empowerment and gender equality. This is very interesting to us, a bit of a surprise to see that the SDGs would be taken so seriously, and we're not 100% sure what's driving this. We're going to be doing some kind of market research on this to better understand it. The third driver is, of course, investments. And as we said, the kind of investments that need to go to women as farmers, but also investments in women's organizations and associations. Much of the investments in women so far has identified them as entrepreneurs, and of course that means they get, investors are able to seek returns back on their investments. But many women, especially women who are farmers, do not identify themselves as entrepreneurs, and would not necessarily be able to generate a return that would satisfy investors seeking market returns. So we need to find ways to invest not only resources, but a lot of capacity building as well in these women's organizations who are providing very critical needs for communities and for women in communities. And we could underline their role within times of disasters and emergencies, but they're sort of always there in women's lives, and women are using these organizations collectively to gather knowledge, to create savings groups, et cetera, et cetera. So key local level institutions that right now are primarily under the radar of many development organizations. What we need still to get to these, I would say, to be able to meet these three drivers are metrics, number one. We need an accountability system. We need a measurement system. We need to know when companies, governments, NGOs are really doing something meaningful versus when they're doing something which we have now labeled pinkwashing, inspired by the greenwashing term, but it not necessarily in a negative, not in a punitive way, but trying to see that many times organizations think they're doing something significant, but actually when it's seen and measured rigorously in terms of results, it doesn't appear that way. So we need metrics in order to be able to do this. We need perhaps traceability. And I'll say even a label. I mean, if we are going to be able to have incentives that allow consumers to know when they can purchase something that helps women, we need to say there's a label and a standard behind it that indicates to those consumers that women are being fairly treated, fairly compensated. We need to also assure that women are represented in decision making, and here I'll talk about climate change at all levels. I think there's back to the compliance mechanism that I wanted to mention. The Green Climate Fund, which is the UNFCCC's large fund they're hoping for $100 billion, which is going to be available to entities that get approved by the fund in order to disseminate their funds. Well, much to all of our surprise and delight, this fund has now made it a compliance mechanism is in place that in order to become an entity, you need to show your interest and your capabilities to work in gender. You need to have internally a policy for gender. You need to show that you've got a track record in working in gender-related activities, and you need to show that you have staff who have the capabilities to do so. So this is the kind of meaningful compliance that we're looking to take forward. We're also watching Clean Climate Fund to see that they're serious about it. So far, I think they are. We sit on as an observer to the board, and I've been impressed. So this is interesting. And then there's always need to provide funding so that women can be involved in those meetings and decision making. And we, again, so these are my general ideas. And just in a few minutes, I want to show you on the PowerPoint some of the ideas that the initiative WOCON's developed to sort of address these kind of things. Okay, this slide I think I've already talked to about the importance and the need to get money back to the women and compensation. So we came up with something to create measurable change in the lives of women, and we created the W+ standard. I will just talk very briefly, and I could get into a lot more, but there's a website that can direct you to if you're interested to hear more. But it is a measurement system. It was inspired by the system to measure carbon. That doesn't mean we're measuring carbon, we are not, but we are very much watched the carbon market and how the architecture of the system allowed for a rigorous approach to defining and measuring results. So we are measuring outcomes. The other idea here was to incentivize, again, the project developers, who can be anybody. It could be NGOs, it could be women's groups themselves, it can be donor agencies, anybody who's implementing a project on the ground. We want to incentivize them to do more for women's empowerment. And 3, we wanted to generate new revenues for those women's groups through a results-based payment system. So if you're familiar with the carbon system, this makes a lot of sense. It's just that instead of measuring carbon emissions that are saved through various activities, we're measuring results of women's empowerment. Here it does provide the metrics and a rigorous system. We defined women's empowerment in 6 domains, and was actually not WOCON. This was done in collaboration with women's groups in Western Kenya and in rural Nepal to come up with what they believed constituted empowerment. And so we came up with these 6 ideas: time, income and assets, health, leadership, education and knowledge, and food security. So once we could identify those 6 domains, then we have now been able to produce the methods for each of those that combine qualitative and quantitative data that are specific to each of those 6 domains. And those are adjusted as the need be, as the context requires it. But this is what is allowing the metrics, that is for the transparency and the effectiveness. It's a results-based framework. So in addition to the measurement of this, that is then coming out in the form of a unit, we quantifying the result as a unit. And we do that through a formula that allows us to combine qualitative and quantitative data. The unit is what embeds the result. So that it may be confusing to some, but it also allows us to trade and to seek a market, to build a market around the sale of the units. In addition to the units, it's also a certification. So it is really the world's first certification of projects that bring this increased social and economic benefits for women. We've listed here the type of projects that we see as maybe most commonly using those, but we want to state very clearly that the W Plus can be applied to any sort of project. It is not necessary to apply it to environment, renewable energy, and these things, but it does fit very nicely into those things. What's different about the W Plus standard is it provides women with two different types of benefits. One is from the actual activities that the project developer is undertaking that should be developed with these women's groups in consultation. The second and rather unique way is that when the units are sold, a percentage or a flat fee of those units goes back to the women's groups involved in the project. And this money is to be managed by them. They are the ones who determine what they want to do with it and to monitor its use. As part of the standard, it's necessary for the project developer to monitor. It needs to be audited, needs to be reported to make sure it's reaching the beneficiaries that's intended to do. But I think it is again like fair trade for women, with a piece of the revenue of the unit sales coming back to the women's groups themselves. This is probably longer than I'd like to talk, but for those of you who are really interested to see it, how it goes, just a note here that it is got the process has an independent third-party accredited auditor who comes to visit the project to verify the results. This is not intended to be a heavy or very expensive operation. The auditor generally spends maybe 2 days only in a project. But we do need, the rigor of the process requires a baseline data, then some activities undertaken, then results measured at some time later to be determined by the project developer. We don't specify it's after 1 year or anything like that. So once the verifier comes and the number of units can be verified, WOCON does generate the W Plus units, and then those are available for sale. We do work with a couple brokers who are brokering those sales. More and more, there are potential buyers interested in carbon plus W Plus or carbon plus social benefits. So we're just now starting to build the capabilities and tap into that new market. But there's also the possibilities to look at how to use the W Plus as a label. It can indicate along a supply chain that's been verified that a particular consumer item does deliver and bring these benefits to women. So the idea here is also to incentivize the project developers so that there's a profit in it for them as well, once they're able to either sell the units to a buyer, or to perhaps obtain the extra money that's required to do this kind of measurement and verification from the donor, from the private sector company, from the bank, or whoever else is most interested to see these transparent results. Quickly, here's some of the applications to date. You can see more on our website. You can see that so far it's been working around renewable energies. We just started also within Livelihoods Project to look at food security and things like this. The demand, as I said, comes from either donors who are increasingly, and some of even the government donors are now even themselves admitting that their work and the investments in women's empowerment and gender has not had the results that they want, and are now switching over to a results-based reporting and investing mechanism. So this is perfect for them. It's also for governments and companies who, as I said, would set internal targets for women's empowerment. For those even traditional carbon offset buyers who now seek to buy carbon in a way that supports social and community livelihoods, as well as the SDGs. The women branding idea, this is, again, the use of the label. The data shows that something like 85% of consumer decisions in the US and Europe are made by women. So we feel that this is a very large untapped potential. There's also lots of companies and individuals who just want to do good, who do sincerely want to improve the lives of women and women producers in their supply chains. And this is a way also to use the W Plus as a planning tool, as a design tool, not only a measurement and kind of evaluation tool. It's also, I think, important that we allow ways for individuals to jump into this who wish to support women's empowerment. It provides a pretty easy way. Individuals can buy X number of units and know that the purchase of the unit is the purchase of the result. And they also know that a percent of that comes back to the women along the supply, women in the communities. And the other big demand we're hearing from is social impact investors, including some very large banks and financial institutions who are now increasingly understanding and ready to invest in social impact. And what the W Plus provides them is the currency of the return. So the idea that you can invest in something without seeking a financial return, you can now see a social return back, again, that's in a quantifiable unit, such as a W Plus unit. Just quickly, I think I've said most of everything here. I think some of the other thing we're hearing about from investors, including gender lens investors, is that they want to go beyond the do no harm. Investors say not only do they want to be able to sleep well at night, they want their money to do something good for the world. So this is something else we're hearing. So again, back to my 3 drivers to go to scale: compliance, incentives, investments. You may be able to see now how this W Plus standard can actually address each one of these. And we are working with various donors and with this market-based approach to bundle the carbon units with the W Plus units. So I think that's where I would like to leave it for now, Sarah, and I would really love to be able to hear any questions or comments or criticisms that any of you have.
Great, thanks, Jeanette, and thanks for all of that information to questions from our listeners. So we will go through as much as we can for the next 10 to 15 minutes. I'd like to start by asking our first question, who comes from a listener, and she asks, when we make up half the world's population, you might say that if we ignore women, we do that at our own peril. Would you say that this inequality spans various industries as well as geographic boundaries, even though your work focuses on Asia and Africa?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and at all levels, and not just in the developing world. I mean, I think it's very clear. Even we see in Silicon Valley, for example, women in some of the most innovative, well-financed industries in the world, there's a lot of sexism and gender inequality going on. So absolutely, it's not unique to agriculture, natural resource management, or anything else. I think Wokan felt that there was a very large gap in the world's attention to the role of women as farmers when we first started up, and which is why we limited our field to this particular sectors.
Thanks, Jeanette. And our next question reads, you mentioned women are not recognized as farmers, but there are groups trying to change this. What are some organizations that are making a biggest difference?
Well, I want to say, for example, for those of you who may have heard, there's, I'm trying to think who comes easily to mind. Root Capital is an organization here in the US that's investing and providing loans to farmers, which is not in itself very new and innovative. But I think they themselves had an aha moment when they were realizing that, wow, it's actually women, not just men. And so they shifted, and that's to their credit. And they developed specific programs that now address women's financial literacy and the need to teach women farmers how to manage money better, for example. There's some NGOs, trying to think, and a few donors, not very many that come to mind. There are some of the, and if you want names, I think, well, let me use some of the big names. I think World Bank has put a lot of attention to it, and now the World Bank seems to have made a shift to be very serious about gender. In the past, as in a lot of organizations, there's a lot of attention, there's a lot of talk, but we can't always see, as I said, whether those are just activities and outputs that are being measured. So I think the key here is to see who's measuring the results, and so who's putting in the money, but not only putting in the money, but who's demanding that the results come back as well. So yeah, there's a bunch of groups that are still around Washington D.C., where Food Tank is. Of course, there are many. We worked with Heifer International for many years. There's many. I think for me, a little bit frustrating is that the Gates Foundation seems to have backed off the focus on women farmers that they started out many years ago. So we feel we're constantly needing to advocate for this. And as I said, why I was surprised when at this meeting that I was in was it Singapore? No, Hanoi, was that we are taking it for granted that it's already reached a certain level of awareness. And then we're in opportunities and meetings where we see, in fact, it's not. So, but we even know that some of the private sector companies are also increasingly understanding that and not only they're users of their seeds or whatever else, but they're recognizing also that these are the buyers of their seeds. So there's a market, there's a need to address women as consumers right down at the community levels as well.
And the next question reads, can you discuss women as the main earners? I've seen research that says women are more likely to use their earnings to support their families or invest in their children's health or education.
Yes, absolutely. And I didn't put up the slide. We usually have a slide that shows from UNICEF, actually, that's a really good one, that shows that women invest, what is the number? I'm probably not going to come up with a number, but the largest percentage of investments. And what we hear a lot from Africa in particular is investments in school fees and education. So it's clear, and here it's about the compensation to women. I don't know if women are primary earners, certainly not to the extent that they should be or deserve to be. What I didn't talk a lot about was the sheer amount of time that consumes women's time. The women we work with in Nepal, I think it's really about 20-hour work days. So that one of the key things we realize, and the women told us ourselves, is you have to first and foremost address our lack of time. We are not able to attend trainings. We're not able to become women leaders in the community simply because of the workload burdens that we bear. So that, I think, is a very fundamental thing we have to keep in mind. We need to enable women to develop skills to earn the income in ways that they can, but as long as they're under this drudgery of fuel wood collection, water collection, just some things that don't need to take up so much time. I think this is the one way we can start to also release women's time. And then, of course, time alone is not going to do anything. We need there to be more investments in programs that can make use of that spare time to develop their opportunities for income generation, for example. Or I mean, the women we talked to in Nepal just said, we want to be better farmers. We want to learn how to diversify our agricultural production systems. But we just have never had the time to be able to attend an agriculture extension training session. So.
Thanks, Jeanette. And the next question comes from our listener, and writes, Jeanette, I was excited to hear about the W plus standard. Can you expand on how, as a business owner, we can gather more information on applying?
Yeah, I can send you to the website. That's an easy one. The website is, I should have written that up, but it's wplus.org. Or if you go to the WOCAN site, you can get in from that way as well. WOCAN is just www.wocan.org. But the W Plus site is wplus.org.
Great, and I just plugged those into our chat box too, so that our listeners could jot those down and check them out after our call today. And the next question comes and reads, there are increasingly creative ways to draw more of a spotlight on the importance of female farmers, including Female Food Heroes, a reality TV show that features a group of female farmers in Tanzania. What are some other creative ways you at WOCAN or others have drawn the spotlight on women?
Good question. I think, it's so hard to do everything. And I think our team at WOCAN, we need so many more ideas about communication and communication outlets, and how do we best use social media, and how do we best get these messages across. We feel that in the world of so many messaging things, it's difficult to do this, but I think we need to do a much better idea. The idea of the W Plus and the units has generated enormous interest. But it's still, I think it's a little bit too innovative, and so it hasn't brought about the kind of sales of those units that we think needs to happen. And so we need to ourselves start to become much more involved in market development, generating awareness around this. And we just won an award in climate change that will be announced next month. And so we hope to, be able to use that kind of knowledge, use that to generate awareness and knowledge of what this kind of system could do. And we've tracked it through to the benefits to women. So we've actually returned the money from the sale of units to these women's groups in Nepal. And they're currently implementing what, it was a small amount of money because we were not able to sell many units at the time. But nevertheless, for those women, it's their money, and that's significant. And they get to decide what to do with it. So they're currently in the process of implementing small things. They use it for, buying goats and chicken, or building a water supply system or something like this. And then, so once we're able to tell that whole story, I think we'll be able to market it. But this is difficult. And even, we're a women-led organization. We don't have a lot of resources, typical of most women-led organizations. So we get a lot of ideas, a lot of big ambitions, but we just can't do it all. But your point is well taken. There are very many creative ways to tell stories, and we all need to get better at doing that.
It's been really exciting to see that we do have female farmers tuning into our webinar today as well. So these last two questions, I think, go well with each other and are both from either aspiring or current female farmers. The first reads, as a young female farmer, one of the biggest hurdles I've encountered is finding the startup funding and support and resources to get started. Where can I find this type of support? What advice would you give to women who are just starting out as farmers?
Oh boy. Well, I think the first question is again points to the need that farmers need capital. They need to get started. Now, I don't know where you're a farmer, if you're in the developing world or you're in the industrialized world, so it's hard to know. There's different resources available at different levels. I mean, there are some funds, and there are, like, I can't speak without knowing which country you're in, but some of the countries we work in Africa and South Asia, for example, even the government does even earmark funds for providing capital to women farmers. The interesting thing is that women never find out about it. So this is, again, we've started, and sorry that I'm probably not able to answer your question about this, but just to say there are places where there are funds available, but you have to really go search for it. Another thing we've been doing at WOCON is starting up what we call women leadership circles in agriculture. And we've done this in about 5 countries. And what we do is we create just a forum where women farmers come together with women policymakers and professionals. And that has, in South Africa, for example, where we've done this, it's been fascinating because through that channel, women farmers have come to learn about resources that are already out there and available, but that they had no information about. Sometimes, I have to say, in some countries, that information is maybe consciously withheld. I don't want to say it in all places, but this is where women's leadership is key. You need leadership. You need someone to step up and start to find out where those resources are, and then demand your rights to equal share of those resources. But having said that, it's still not sufficient. There's still not enough capital out there. This is a space right now where there's a lot of investors out there, and there's a whole group of people called gender lens investors. It's kind of a growing movement here in the US and part in Europe as well, of investors, most of whom are women, but not exclusively, who want their private investment money to be used for the good of women around the world. So what we're seeing is there's a lot of this pots of money in the investors' hands, and on the other side, there's needs for money by women's organizations and women farmers, but there's a big gap in between. Because investors are not easily giving money. They've got to see business plans. They've got to be sure that there's transparency and accountability to their investments. This is where we're trying to work out ways now where the W+ standard can provide the kind of metrics into these investor funds that would give investors a little bit more confidence that they can do things that generate results for women's empowerment. But these are big questions. Advice for new farmers, it's beyond what I'm able to provide here, but I would just encourage you, find out everything you can about what locally is available in terms of information. There's now, if you have internet, you have access to so much.
Great, thanks, Jeanette. And we're out of time today, but I just want to express our gratitude for you sharing your knowledge and expertise with our audience and us. And thank you to all of our listeners for sending in some great questions this afternoon. So it's truly been a pleasure to spend this Wednesday with all of you, and I hope to see you all again here soon. We do have additional webinars coming up, and you can register on foodtank.com. So thanks to everyone again, and have a great rest of your day.